Really important to the VLV and our members is the quality and range of broadcasting more locally, both in the UK and the nations of the UK, in its regions and in local areas. And that's what we're going to be concentrating on in this next panel segment. It's once again, I think we've got an excellent lineup of speakers, and I will now hand over to Mark Mardell, known to very many of us as the presenter of The World This Weekend, The World at One, and distinguished career as radio in particular, television broadcaster and journalist with BT. So it's now over to you, Mark.
Welcome, hello. Good afternoon to everybody. The title of this session implies a big question: the future of local, regional and national TV and radio. A future of what? Worry, cuts and shrinking ambition? Or is anyone actually claiming a bright future ahead? In a world where we may all need local connections more than ever, we've seen cuts to local BBC TV and radio, the takeover of commercial radio stations in England by a couple of big players who tend towards centralisation and replacing the truly local with broad regions and central programming. In the national regions, perhaps the outlook is brighter, but is online the future? What does that imply for regulation? With me to talk about all of that and more, I'm delighted to welcome, in alphabetical order, Chris Burns, BBC Head of Local Radio in England. Before that, she was Chief Operating Officer within the BBC's Deputy Director General's Group. Chris started out as a late-night phone-in presenter, so I've read, in Radio Trent and Nottingham, and has worked in both commercial and BBC local radio. When appointed a couple of years ago, she said, "I'm looking forward to helping nurture local talent and leading the work to reinvent local radio for the next generation." Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Damian Collins has been the MP for Folkestone and Hythe for 10 years and was the chair of the Select Committee on Culture, Media and Sport. This summer, he and 22 other MPs wrote to Ofcom concerned that regional broadcasting was taking a disproportionate hit and was questioning whether the BBC was fulfilling its mission and purpose in this field. Good afternoon to you.
Afternoon. Well, still morning, I think, isn't it, just?
Is it? Oh, yes. Well, I'm ahead of the pack as usual. Good morning. Good morning to Matt Deegan as well, founder and creative director of the new media and radio consultancy firm Folder Media. Matt started his career at the Radio Academy and he founded Fun Kids as an online radio station for children. Hello.
Hello.
And finally, last but not least, Owen Evans, the Chief Executive of SC4, the Welsh language channel. He was previously Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Welsh Government. He said not long ago that funding will be tight, but there's a commitment to stability for some time to come, which is not available to every public body. It's a golden age for content producers. Hello to you too.
Morning.
I'd like you all to start with a statement about this issue, and we'll go in the same alphabetical order as we introduced you. Chris Burns, please.
Well, you might expect me to say this, but I think that local radio has got a bright future. And it's interesting, Mark, that you referred to how COVID has reminded us of the importance of localness and community. And I think it's very fair to say that this is a global pandemic, but I think the way in which it's been felt has been very, very localized. You know, the experience in Colchester has been very different to that in Merseyside or Newcastle. And to a certain extent, I think the future of local radio and what I see as being the pillars, if you like, and the foundation will build local radio on the future are based on what we've experienced over the last few months. It had always been there, but I think what COVID has done is bring that to the fore. So I think, you know, trusted news and information, absolutely core to what we do. Connecting with communities, core to what we do. Being, if you like, that front door to the BBC from wherever you live in England, absolutely core to what we do. And also, and I don't use this word lightly, I think the importance of companionship, because a lot of people have found themselves during this period of lockdown feeling incredibly isolated. And local radio and radio in general has been a great friend. I was at a station meeting in Middlesbrough, and a listener from Radio Tees wrote something along the lines of, you know, I thought I was on my own, I listened to you, and I realized I wasn't. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. I talked about the way in which this has been a global pandemic, but been felt very local. And because local radio is, as it says on the tin, based in the area, I think we have been able to react to that. So if you look at Leicester, for example, I saw it was on the 10 o'clock news last night. It's been in lockdown for an awful long time. The night when that happened, Radio Leicester stayed on air explaining what it was going to mean to people in Leicester, and has continued to do that. It also supplied Gujarati bulletins and public services announcement on Alexa and smart speakers, again to serve the audience. When the Liverpool City region announced it was going to have the testing, again we were there to explain what that actually meant and when you were to qualify for that. So it's being able to offer very trusted and highly localized information that's been an important part of what we do. I think also, we have been very alive to the need for community. And to a certain extent, just as local radio has always done, we have acted as that virtual notice board through the initiative like Make a Difference. Captain Tom, who's become a bit of a global superstar, he first came to our attention through Three Counties Radio based in Dunstable. He contacted them because he wanted to raise awareness that he was making money for the NHS, or wanted to raise funds for the NHS. He had a very modest target, and as you know, raised well over £32 million. And since then, there have been a variety of TV documentaries and books about him. And it was very interesting. We carried out a number of focus groups during this period, and there was a woman from Manchester who was listening to Make a Difference, and we asked her what she liked about it, and she said, well, even though I know I may not be doing these things, the fact that I know people are doing good things in my area makes me at a very dark time feel good. So I think that's really important. And I think too, local radio there, as if you like, to provide spiritual sustenance through the church services, Islamic, Sikh and Hindu reflections. So I think that's been a really important part of what we've done during COVID, and that connection with communities is something local radio has always had, and I believe is something we need to strengthen over the next period. And likewise, acting as that front door for the BBC, I'm now based in the Southeast. I wasn't based in the Southeast when I was born. I was born in Liverpool, lived in the Midlands. And I remember thinking, well, you've got to move, if you like, to London. You've got to do this. I think local radio can act as that front door for the BBC. It's done it through things like BBC Introducing, where, again, during COVID, we saw a massive increase in the number of people trying to upload tracks. And it's also done it through things like Upload, which is a speech version of BBC Introducing. And there, we found that we had so many submissions, we were able to launch a virtual 3-day festival featuring comedy, poetry and performance work. So I think, and yes, you would expect me to say this, I think that what we need to do in the future is actually what we've been doing a lot of, but we need to kind of really dial up areas like that news, information, the connection with communities, being that front door for the BBC, and also being a really good, trusted local friend. So yes, we may live in a global media age, but COVID has taught us that actually local is just as important.
Thank you. That begs a lot of questions, and I hope we'll ask them, and the audience.
I'm sure you will.
Also. Please put your questions down and I'll try and get them asked. But next, Damian.
Thank you very much. I think this is a really important debate, and I think there is a real danger that if we start that debate thinking everything's fine, then we're starting from the wrong place. Because we're going through, and we all know this, a massive period of change and disruption in the media, driven by the shift to online media and technology and the disruption that has caused in the industry. Now, and I think you can look at that across sectors. So for local news gathering, for newspaper print journalism, we've seen a decline there, not because it's been replaced by a better product, but because Google and Facebook have disrupted the advertising market so much that those papers have become unsustainable. And in some parts of the country, local news gathering outside of the BBC, and to an extent the regional ITV stations, has largely stopped, minimal compared to what it was. So we've seen that happening for a number of years with print journalism. If you look at the BBC, the Director General has set a challenge to say he wants everyone on the BBC, every commissioner, programme maker, producer, to work on the basis that they will have 80% less money to make stuff in the future than they have now, and to come up with plans accordingly. And the question that we really posed in the letter that you alluded to earlier, Mark, was what's the BBC for? Should it be the case that if the BBC does have to make over the next decade 20% savings, then is that made equally? Is that 20% out of local radio just as much as it's 20% out of Radio 1? Or should there be some things that are ring-fenced? However, really the BBC talks about the budget reductions in news gathering and regional news gathering, local radio, there's going to be less of it. You can make a case to say, well, we think we can, BBC can make a case to say, well, we believe we can make a product that's just as good or if not better with less resource. But let's be really clear, it's doing it with less resource because it's trying to make savings. There's, you know, if you look at the pressure on the public finances now and actually declining revenue from the license fee, it's difficult to make a case to say the BBC in real terms is going to have more money in the next few years than it has today. It's probably going to have less in real terms. And therefore, it has to look seriously at where it makes cuts. And I think we have to pose a question back to say, well, should there be some bits that are ring-fenced because they're so important? ITV and Channel 4, like the rest of broadcasting, is seeing declining audiences across the board. Now, Peter Bazalgette was right a moment ago. There are some shows which do really, really well, particularly with younger audiences, but across the board, those audiences are declining. And if you're a business that survives based on advertising revenue, if you've got declining audiences, you're going to have declining revenue in an increasingly competitive world. So what does that mean for news gathering and broadcasting on other public service broadcasting channels and networks as well? Now, those are being disrupted and challenged too. So there is this challenge of how is the news gathering and telling the stories of our country. We've relied on these channels in the past, be it local radio, local newspapers, and public service broadcasting. All of those face significant budget challenges. All of those are going to retreat in some way. So what does that mean? And what do we want to value and protect, keep and protect? That's got to be fundamental. We've got to recognize this is happening. Alongside the shift to digital is a shift to informal channels. More people today get their news, their actual news from social media each week than get it from print newspapers and radio combined. If you look at the younger audiences, they get more news from social media than they get from television as well. There's only older adults that really keep television as the main channel. And so you're moving then from news being presented in a curated space, be that a news website or a radio station or a TV station, to a state where an editor puts those programs together, makes informed decisions on what they think is the most important issues that audience needs to know about. And you're giving that power to an algorithm. And what we're seeing around the world now, we're seeing it with COVID disinformation, we're seeing it with movements like QAnon in America, is the era of conspiracy theories where people can receive a very large quantity of news and information, not because it's accurate or true or the most important, because that's what the algorithm of their social media platform is directing them towards and potentially giving them a very distorted impression of what the world looks like. So I think we have these two problems at the moment, which we think we need to be honest about how we're going to confront, which is the financial pressures on traditional news gathering and the rise of informal news gathering, which is leading to a rise in belief in conspiracy theories and harmful disinformation that I think in the long run can have a great deal of harm to society. And we all know there's a lot more to being a democracy than holding elections, and the ability of people to access important, factually accurate information about their communities is really important for them when they make decisions about how they vote, but also when they make all sorts of important decisions about their lives.
Two vitally important questions that really get to the heart of the issues we're discussing today, so we'll certainly come back to those. Matt?
Yeah, I thought it was useful to sort of look at why we are where we are, particularly when we look at commercial radio. You know, commercial radio in the UK started in sort of 1973, driven by basically regulatory intervention. You know, there weren't that many frequencies, so it was a limit to what could be launched. Now, stations grew in the 80s and 90s, but again, strictly regulated, growth was limited. So there's actually quite a lot of barriers to new entrants. You know, you had probably one local radio station where you lived. And I think sometimes we talk about, you know, local radio, particularly commercial radio, commercial radio local success in audience and revenue terms. And we often think, well, that must be down to the programming, but actually it's probably also related to the fact that we're in a monopoly position. You know, you're the only person there, so it's going to do quite well. You know, historically, the commercial radio sector always wanted to grow, but in the 80s and 90s, there were limits to owning more than even just like 15% of the market. And then when national commercial radio was introduced, the only station on FM that was allowed was a classical music service. The other two were on AM, what's now TalkSport and Virgin Radio. Plus, commercial radio had strong competition from BBC, from Radio 1 and Radio 2, which obviously it still does today. So throughout all this time, over the last kind of 40 years, commercial radio has always been keen to compete with the BBC and provide services that listeners want, but it's remained incredibly regulated. I think what's interesting now is that, in 2020, where the vast majority of regulation in radio has disappeared, we've seen consolidation into 3 radio groups: Global, Bauer and the Wireless Group predominantly. And a lot of those local radio stations are now part of national networks, so Heart or Capital or Greatest Hits. I had a look, and there's probably only around 20 stations that aren't really part of local networks now. So it's been huge consolidation in the sector. Now, local content still exists, but it's changed. Those stations have to provide local news and travel and weather and information, but the sort of days of having local presenters from your town have gone. And I think, sometimes there's a view that that's a bad thing, and that's a shame. But when you look at the audience figures for ILR, for these local radio stations, I had a look 15 years ago, and it attracted about 25 million people. Now, today, if you look at what's still on those frequencies, it's actually still 25 million people. The content has changed kind of dramatically from being very local to being kind of mostly national, but it's something that audiences still consume. And I think, as Damian was saying, consumers' access to information has changed hugely over that time. When I was growing up and it was snowing, I tuned to my local radio station, 2CR-FM, to hear whether Kings Park Junior School was going to be closed because of all the snow. It was an essential way to find out. They could reach many people. But families now in that situation are going to be texted directly from their school or hear it from Class F's WhatsApp group. So there's obviously still huge amount of room for radio and for local radio to reflect its community, but how they consume information entertainment, I think, has changed hugely. I think one of the interesting opportunities that digital brings, and that can be digital radio or other services, is it can be kind of market driven. And I think in lots of places, the gap in the market is doing a local radio service, but that gap could also be a service for the older community or South Asians. And I think our audiences are much cleverer with how they receive information. I think just because certain media owned local in the past doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the ones that own it in the future.
Matt, thanks very much. Owen?
Thanks for the opportunity. Diolch am y croeso. I mean, perhaps first it might be worth referencing who we are for those who haven't come across S4C. We're the only full-time Wales broadcasting service. We're the only national broadcaster focused on and based in Wales. We offer a full service across all genres, with about 100% originated and first transmission content in peak hours. We also broadcast from 6 o'clock in the morning to midnight throughout the UK with daily preschool content. In fact, we're the second biggest commissioner of children's content after the BBC in the UK. And we support catch-up through a range of supplementary content through our player and S4C Click. Economics is important in this. We're a publisher broadcaster. We keep the Welsh independent production sector going round in a way that others don't. I think we are the smallest independent PSB, even smaller than Channel 5. And arguably, we're probably the most PSB of the PSBs. We have the Rheithian trio of purposes allied with an overriding mission to support the growth and the use of the Welsh language across communities as traditional as rural Wales, through to increasingly digital communities across the UK and indeed the globe. And it was nice to hear Rishi Sunak saying recently that we've become an integral part of the fabric of Welsh culture. And I probably should stress the UK role, which will probably surprise people. We're growing quicker across the UK than actually in Wales. And although you may not have heard of S4C, you may have certainly heard of some of our award-winning content like Keeping Faith, Hidden, which were both S4C originals that the BBC then came on board with. We've just confirmed our first series on Amazon Prime, Hugh Brassington's 47 Summits. And just as a quick plug, we'll be the only free-to-air broadcaster of Wales versus England at the weekend. And part of that growth has been that, although we're Welsh language, about 3/4 of our content is subtitled. But we're not different to other people. We've had to develop a strong digital offering. We've about a third of the Welsh language audience signed up to our player, S4C Click. And during COVID, we've been getting about 1.5 million views a month of our short form content through our suite of youth orientated brands, the biggest being Hatch. So we're small, but we can move quickly. Now, broadcasting isn't evolved, so our budget is decided by DCMS and the Secretary of State. And from 2022, for the first time, will be funded entirely through the licence fee alongside the BBC. So as part of that process, not surprisingly, we'll be articulating what our role as a PSB will be for the future. And one of those things actually will be not just being a national broadcaster, but how we're going to get to local. I pick up on Damian's point, really. I mean, I can see there is a retreat in some regards, particularly in news, from our communities. And one of the areas that particularly during COVID we've ramped up on is our news coverage, but also the fact we, for the first time, have journalists actually located within S4C. We are local. You know, I communicate to my audience through Facebook Live sessions where we get about 10,000 views. So we are slightly different, but we face many of the same issues that everyone else is fighting. We're fighting the tide of global economics and ensuring local and our programs are both attractive, prominent, and accessible to our audience. And like all the PSBs, actually, we're having to tread that tightrope of keeping our traditional viewers engaged whilst we use new platforms to entice viewers. But perhaps I'll leave you with a statement that came from one of our viewers about the importance of having national broadcasters. I remember by national, I'm talking about Welsh, English, Scottish, Northern Irish. And that quote was, "If only we had an S4C in English."
Very good point, interesting point, which we may get around to discussing. But I wanted to go back to Chris. As you can imagine, you put a very powerful case for the importance of local radio. Allied to what Damian said, and remembering how expensive TV is compared to radio, and particularly local radio, should you be going to the Director General, Tim Davey, and saying, "Look, Tim, Antiques Roadshow, brilliant, love it, but get rid of it for a series and you can fund local radio forever and a day"?
I think Tim has actually, if you think about it, he's not been there very long. And I know it was said earlier on, cut him a bit of slack, but he's already, reiterated his commitment to local radio. I mean, Sir Tony Hall was a big fan of local radio and was very public about that. I think Tim sees it as in a different kind of way, but as equally supportive. And, he's repeated his commitment to some of the things said in the annual plan about potentially putting more investment in services in the Midlands and the North. So I think that's there in a public document, and Tim's repeated that. I think from my point of view, I'm not blind to the fact that audiences have got lots of different other areas in which they can consume news these days. And I think picking up on Damian's point, it's kind of different need states, isn't it? You come to, I, for example, I will wake up in the morning, I will look at my phone for the headlines. I'll then actually turn the radio on or turn the television on because I want a human voice to explain that to me. And that may be different age groups doing different things at different times of the day. But it's interesting that during the last spell, what we have seen is we saw an increase in interaction to our local radio stations. I also think that, I appreciate too that local radio is never going to be immune from financial challenges. The fact is, when you're trying to do journalism, as you will well know, and everybody else on this panel today, journalism is expensive. So what I've kind of outlined today is that, yes, the things we are going to focus on in terms of our investment in local radio will be around those things that are around journalism. It will be around those things that are about connecting with communities, new talent. It will also be there for sport, because I think that local radio can be much more partisan. So local radio in the future may not be able to do everything, but we'll still be able to do those things, I think, that mark us out as being distinct from what you would say get from commercial radio in that space, what you would get online in that space, and also what you would get from network radio. So I think it's very important that we place local radio in the context of the rest of the media landscape.
Do you agree, though, with Damian that it's different? Local radio and maybe news generally is different. It should be ring-fenced. It's a central purpose of the BBC, and it's more important than some other stuff that may have to go.
And I think, well, I think if you look at the amount of money that's still being invested in regional news in the nations, actually we will still have, at the end of the latest savings that have been announced and you're alluding to there, we will still have more journalists outside around the country than any other organization. And I think it is important that we preserve that journalism. I think it's really important that we preserve that accountability factor. You know, that's always going to be part of our DNA. And that's why obviously, you know, we support things like the Local Democracy Reporter scheme. So I think there are initiatives I could point to that would say it is still going to be there. And, you know, it's really important that we focus our efforts around that, because that's also, I think, what makes us unique in those areas as well.
Matt, I may have misunderstood what you were saying, but I got the impression you were sort of saying if there's cuts in things like BBC local radio, so be it. The market's there, it can provide in different ways.
I think what I was saying was that consumers react to content in different ways from different platforms, and just because something's existed for 30 years doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to do it today. I think there's also, I think, two different, when you think particularly about local radio, there's the journalism side, but also there's the belonging side, and there's reflecting local communities. And I think sometimes we can be a bit too driven by the news end, and that, you know, these services are here to just provide information. You know, whenever there's research from listeners, you know, local news is of interest and often of strong interest, but they like to be entertained as well, and they, you know, they like to hear about, I think, as Chris was saying, you know, sport or those sort of things as well. So I don't think you can go, hey, it's all about news. And I think actually there's a danger that if local radio stations merely become news outlets, you'll see strong declines in audiences, because, you know, people aren't particularly tuning in entirely for that reason. And I think sometimes there can be, you know, from a resourcing issue, too much of a shift to providing local news and information content on those radio stations, that they lose out that you know, really reflecting their local communities.
I mean, the BBC is a competitor presumably for you, but do you worry about the attitude towards local news, or do you think it's got it right?
I mean, the first thing, I think we shouldn't march past plurality before we start talking about a monolith supplier. I think plurality of news is actually really important. And I think that on a national, regional basis is one of the things we've still got to fight for. So despite the fact we have our news supplied by the BBC, you know, for the first time ever, I've got journalists working for S4C, and we've been trying to ramp up the differences and editorial changes that can differentiate what we're supplying from what the BBC. I think one of the things that COVID really has demonstrated, though, and it's something we can't lose, is COVID has actually, I think more than anything else over the past decades, supported the advancement of devolution and the understanding of what devolution means. I mean, whatever the Prime Minister said a few weeks ago, I'm not going to comment on. But you can't get away from the fact that in Wales, up until recent times, about 50% of the population didn't know the NHS was devolved, for example. Over COVID, as soon as the briefings are happening in London, we've been having briefings in Cardiff, briefings in Edinburgh, briefings in Northern Ireland. You're starting to see that people understand that decisions are made more on a local basis or a regional or national basis now than they ever have been in the past. And I think although the BBC does a very good job, I think one of the things that's very important for local news and national news on our basis is that we have to reflect, look, this is the news that applies to you. This isn't a UK thing that you can get lost in occasionally, because, you know, the UK news does tend to dominate the news situation. But I think one of the areas the S4C has benefited from, but one of the areas we mustn't lose in the discussions about how we actually develop news for the future, is that plurality is important. And one of the benefits of plurality is that you can actually drill down to a national basis. And again, I use the word national to cover Welsh, English, Scottish, Northern Irish.
And I mean, when you say, I think we can all celebrate plurality in many ways, but I mean, what would you give as an example of, I mean, I take it you're saying that particularly for a Welsh audience, but I mean, you've got BBC Wales, you've got other Welsh outlets. What does plurality give you?
I think what plurality doesn't give you at the moment, which is one of the things we started to see improving over COVID, is that you can't ignore the fact that, you know, outside of London, the reach of the national press, but also the fact that, you know, people who tend to be tuning into the national news the UK programs at, you know, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or whatever. And that's where people are getting their news from in the traditional sense. But through social media, that's where they'll be getting their news from, typically on a UK basis as well. And I think one of the big things that's been apparent over the past few months is that despite the fact you'll have a BBC Wales News at 6, you'll have an ITV News, Wales News at 6 o'clock, those messages prior to COVID, really, to be honest, weren't getting through. And things were still, you know, in the early days of COVID, still being dominated by the big set-piece press conferences in London. Now, if plurality is to work, it means that we need to have the strength and the competition in news services on a national and a regional basis. That means that all of the broadcasters have really got to fine tune and hone their news programs to the specific audience they're going for. You know, the days of one message to all the UK nations being the same are long gone. And so I think in a time of devolution, the role of plurality and the role of news and actually building nations is incredibly strong.
Thanks very much. Damian, do you think Chris answered your questions, or your question particularly about funding?
No, and I think I understand the point she's making about saying the BBC has more journalists working in the UK than anyone else does. Well, it's the national broadcaster. It's a totally different model to anyone else. But the issue here is that, you know, the budget for BBC local radio is about £100 million. So it's less than sort of what 3% of the BBC's annual income. The Director General on his desk every year, £3.5 billion lands on that desk, and he gets to decide how that money is spent. So in some ways you can't say there's no money. You know, certainly if local radio budget is £100 million. Now, as I said earlier on, if you're taking 20% out, you're looking for 20% to come out of the BBC. If that's the Director General wants to plan on that basis, £20 million coming out of BBC One with a commissioning budget of over £1 billion is nothing. 20 billion coming out of local radio, 20 million coming out of local radio out of 100 million is massive. And I think we should look at local radio and say, as Chris said, and she's right, absolutely right about this, the expensive bit is journalism. You can fill the airways with stuff. You can have more music, more generic programming across regions, limit the amount of unique work done by journalists. But I think you're diminishing the quality of the product. And that's what I think we should be saying now. If there's strong evidence, which I believe there is, and Ofcom believe there is, to say, actually, this is what communities want. They want the local radio to be kept as it is. If the cut's going to have to be made, we have to have a grown-up conversation about where those are made. But actually, let's inform ourselves based on what viewers and listeners want from the BBC. I would say with television as well, in the southeast region where my constituency is, the most popular programme in the day in terms of audience is the 6:30 local news. That is the biggest audience the BBC has that day. So is that, to me, that's sending us a signal to say, if there are bits of the BBC that people value, that's one of them. And if difficult decisions got to be made about where money is saved, and often when I say this, people say, "Oh, where would you make the cuts?" Well, you know, I don't really think that's the right response. I think it's about saying, actually, what do we collectively value that we want to protect? And for me, I would look at things like local radio and say, you know, that is something I think we should be protecting. You know, we always get thrown back at MPs saying, well, you know, you always complain when the Parliament channel is cut. Well, I think that is important to democracy, and the budget is about £2 million. You know, so it's a tiny, tiny expense which has a big impact. And again, something I would think our national broadcaster, you know, one of the world's principal news gatherers, should be saying, well, that's core function. And you get to a point with some of these services where if you cut them too much, there's not very much left, and they get a tiny amount of the money the BBC spends every year.
I've got another question for you about the role of government, but I want Chris to answer your points first.
Well, I think when Tim Davies talked about, you know, 80% less, I think what he was talking about, what are those things that you, if you like, could almost supercharge? And one of the challenges I think he's putting to programme makers across the BBC there is, are we doing too many things? And are there certain things we should really, really focus on and kind of say, right, we're going to supercharge that because no one else is doing it, or that's a really brilliant idea. And I think sometimes, and I worked with Tim when he was in network radio when I was there, and I think he would sometimes criticise us us for kind of spreading ourselves too thinly rather than just kind of focusing on what our core purposes are. So I think that's part of what he's talking about when he says that. Now, clearly, I don't want anybody to take any more money out of local radio. And I think the fact that he has been very positive about local radio and what he said about us, I think shows there is a commitment there, and looking at how we can particularly strengthen audiences in areas like the Midlands and the North in particular. You know, and I know they've called out places like Wolverhampton, Bradford and Sunderland, which is not to say there aren't great commercial local services there, but the BBC may be able to do a different job in that market. So I'm, you know, I think one of the things I'd like to reassure people around today that, you know, it's sort of local radio, kind of what COVID has taught it. What are our real core purposes and the things that we should focus on? Because I completely agree with what Owen was saying, that sort of plurality of thought and diversity of voice, because that's one of the things I think that local radio can really help provide. Because, you know, I've talked about COVID, likewise Brexit, and the experience of Brexit and what people were saying about it was very different across the country, and local radio has a unique role to play there.
So I think we should supercharge local radio.
Oh well, I'm not going to disagree.
Absolutely. Well, Damian,
what I would say with that is it following what the audiences are saying and what they want? You know, it's fine to say, okay, we're gonna add another 20% on to BBC local radio, and that's going to make it more successful. But you could say, well, let's look at listening figures. Over the last 15 years, they're down a third, and I don't think that's because of BBC local radio is bad or anything like that. You know, it's a changing market. You know, the reason your local radio, your local TV news is the biggest program in your area is because all the other programs have been split 100 ways with people consuming it in lots of different places. I think the opportunity with the BBC, if they're having to cut different elements of services, is to think about actually how they make them, you know, replicating what happened 30, 40 years ago and ensuring that we're just going to put more money into that because that's the best way to do it, isn't necessarily going to be successful. I think when you look at on the commercial radio side, you talk to some of the commercial radio groups, actually news provision has had more investment because they haven't had to, you know, their regulation has changed. They weren't forced to do things which they knew their audiences didn't want, which cost them loads of money. Now they can actually put money into news and outputs in a different way and not worry so much about where the inputs are.
Can I just pick up on that, Mark, very briefly? And I think when I talk about, yes, supercharging, if you like, local radio, let's use the term radio in the broadest sense of the word. It's about audio and content. So for example, could you also make some of that local content more available on other platforms, on sounds? You know, some people, older people, if you like myself, I'll happily consume, if you like, long form broadcasting. Actually, what we've discovered through things like the pilots we've done on voice is, you know, telling people 5 key things they need to know that day going on in their area can also be effective. So it's about it's increasing localness and how we actually reflect that local service, but it's about a real localness of content. I think we're talking there, rather than, if you like, the building of lots of traditional radio stations.
But I mean, if I can just support that a tad. I mean, picking up Damian and Chris's points, when COVID struck, you know, as a PSB, one of our primary roles is to make sure we're getting information that's correct and accessible out to the audience. Now, when it started, as with everyone else, we saw about 190% increase in our online news. And then that was fairly short form, quite punchy, you know, increase in that. Now, when I put more money into it and I hired journalists additional to what the supply we were getting already to get better and more information out to our public, the figures went up by 500%. So I wouldn't discount the fact that sometimes, you know, if you're going to focus and you think there's a value in something, actually pouring a bit more money into it does make a difference.
Should we have more regional content on TV generally?
I think there's, if I can pick up on that, I think there's, you know, yes is the answer. It's great. You don't see a huge amount of diversity in terms of accents across, you know, the UK broadcast, but I think there are dangers in it. The way to do it is to promote great content from regions and nations, The way not to do it is to commission more content from the nations and regions that suits a UK audience sometimes. Because what you can see occasionally is that they're commissioning a slightly more vanilla version of what would be a strong national or regional content that they might think in their wisdom suits the UK audience better. So as long as you can keep that strong identity associated with national and regional content, absolutely. But I would always guard against the fact that the temptation is always there to make that a little more vanilla to suit everyone, and really to fight against that.
I realise that this might be in danger of being an old bloke's question and talking about a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. But when I started off at commercial radio, Radio Tees in Teesside, and we took our journalism extremely seriously, and all the commercial radio stations did. We had a 20-minute news programme at lunchtime. We really were passionate about it. What's happened to commercial radio in that sense, and are people worried about it? I mean, we did ask the two main players on, they said we didn't give them enough notice, so that's fair enough. But I mean, Damian, are you worried about what's happening to commercial radio or just BBC?
I think I'm worried about any media that is reliant on advertising for its revenue, because that is a market that is rapidly declining, and actually COVID accelerating that process. And so I think that there have been some successes. I mean, Matt mentioned services like global radio and the consolidation in the commercial sector to provide sort of entertainment channels really that have bits of news and bits of other things in. And they're good companies. And the quality, I fight a constant battle with my children to keep them off Capital Radio, because not because I don't like it, because there's only a certain amount I can listen to in a car journey. But these services are not what they were, and they're being hollowed out by declining ad revenue. What we're seeing is not a market failure of the quality of the product. We're seeing a market failure in the diminishing of the revenue that's kept these services going, and that money is shifted to principally Google and Facebook, and it is hollowing out these services. And I think and so far we've afforded ourselves the luxury of saying, well, it's only a few commercial radio stations, it's only a few newspapers. Now this wave is washing up against the independent television sector as well to the same effect. And that's why I think we've got to say, actually, safeguarding local news gathering and telling the story of the nation, it may well be that we have to look to the BBC and other news agencies to do that, because commercially these businesses which did it independently and proudly and well in the past just can't afford to devote those resources to it. So it's not just an issue about the BBC, absolutely not. It affects the whole sector, I think.
I think also it's looking at consumer demand. So commercial radio has never had as many listeners as it does today. It is more successful than it's ever been, and of course there has definitely been a shift. The consolidation of local radio. A lot of that was just driven by historic regulation. LBC, Times Radio, talk radio, if you like that sort of thing too. Actually high quality speech services we're able to run now because of National Digital Radio. Fun Kids, national DAB radio station. It's almost entirely public service. It services 6 to 11-year-olds. BBC choose not to make much children's radio content. And we can do it because the market can support it. And Dame is absolutely right, and there are COVID challenges in advertising. Particularly what you've seen is actually the big drop has been in local radio revenues versus national radio revenues. And for commercial radio, it has lowered its cost base by reducing commitment to local local production, but there's still a vast majority of local output, be that local news or travel, or those sorts of things.
Matter of interest, what is behind that drop in local revenue that for 30 years seemed to be there?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think local businesses have been more strongly affected by coronavirus. The first thing you always cut is the marketing budget, and also core commercial radio advertisers historically, car dealers, double glazing stores, all those sorts of things. Actually, Google advertising or Facebook ads, which can be locally targeted, can be as good. And I think historically, local commercial radio was the only way that those advertisers could reach those audiences, and obviously that's not the case anymore. So the market has to react.
Well, I think you can see market reaction on audio content. I mean, podcasting is a demonstration of how technology has led to an absolute boom in audio content being produced, and a lot of it very commercial and very successful. And in some ways, I would see Times Radio, which I think is a fantastic step, is a way of an existing news organization, which traditionally produced a print product, to use the same people to create an audio product for an audio audience, either podcasting or live. And I think that's absolutely great. I think there's this other component though, which is the localized news gathering, telling the stories of the nation, which in the past has been done by a certain audience of people, journalists working for the local BBC, commercial radio, or local newspapers, and that is significantly under pressure. The BBC has largely kept that going, but other areas are really struggling, and the BBC too. But I agree with you. I don't think what the BBC should be doing is looking to also overly compete against commercial services that are already providing a similar product and doing it well. But my slight concern at the moment is there are some core functions that they provide and a few others provide, which are really under threat and which we should value.
We've got a question coming in from Jan Leventhal. What is the panel's thoughts about commercial or independent local television stations? Should they be funded even if some of their content is amateur? They do provide local news and content, e.g. Knots TV. I think, Owen, first of all?
I think probably so. You know, nobody's hit on the model that I think works in every scenario. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face. But as I alluded to in the opening statements, you know, we're seeing a gradual erosion of coverage, particularly of news from local and hyperlocal situations. And you know, that is the most clear market failure you can almost find in the realms of PSBs. So people like S4C are looking at getting closer to the audience by investing in those types of areas. Now, we're doing it because I can see people moving away from that, and I think there is a market there and there is a demand from the audience there. But that's in a very small context of the Welsh language. But I can see on a wider basis across the UK, as you know, the type of news coverage we're talking about retreats from these areas, but local interest is strong and is growing, I suspect, in these areas. Then there is probably a hybrid place where people can get together and form potentially commercial models. And if not commercial now, then pre-commercial models that perhaps there is a role for government to seed fund.
I'm horrified to see that we've only got 5 minutes left. I want to get to Damian's second really important point about control of digital online media. I was struck by, I know it's very different in the States, but Obama's recent interview, he was saying that you used to go to a town and there'd be the newspaper editor would have a crew cut and be wearing a bow tie, and you knew he was a Republican, but he'd give you a good fair hearing, and he'd say this guy's a liberal from Chicago, but nevertheless, you know, write him up and give you a fair shout. Now you go there and there's just white noise from right-wing media. Well, he was complaining about right-wing media, but unregulated. Matt, do we have to have more regulation?
Well, I think we're very lucky in the UK that broadcast media has that independence. Obviously, newspapers don't and never have. Online can take a perspective too. I think it's important that we share some truths. And looking at America, I think there's more of an argument for reinforcing it here. But, you know, it's interesting, local radio, back to commercial local radio, hugely regulated. If I was to launch a local news website in Weston-super-Mare, obviously no regulation that sits around that, and I can change and do what I want.
Should it be regulated?
I don't think it can be. I think it's if you add in regulation, it wouldn't exist at all. And is that better or worse? I think it'd probably be worse.
Damian?
I don't agree with that. You can regulate it, and I think we should regulate based on audience and influence. I think it's one thing to say, you know, there's people who've got a freedom of speech right to express their views on their Facebook page. It's a totally different thing to say that people have got a right to broadcast their opinions through social media to millions of people in a totally unregulated way, and that social media companies should say, well, should allow their amplification tools, their algorithms, to boost content to millions of people and be totally blind as to what that content is. Now, and I think what we've seen in America since the election is, you know, an attempt to assert a fraud has been committed in the elections based on no evidence, and social media has become the principal channel through which those lies have been spread. And I saw a survey that says about half of people that voted Republican now actively believe there was a vast criminal conspiracy during the election to steal it away from Donald Trump. And those views have been formed by social media. The fact that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 people here don't believe that the COVID vaccine will be safe, you know, has been fueled by conspiracy theories on social media. So my view is that if a social media company can see big audiences being reached through its platform, its own tools amplifying those voices, then that's what we can regulate. And I was interested to see there was a study done by Facebook in 2016, which they tried to keep secret but leaked out, looking at hate speech in Germany. And they found there that 60% of people that joined Facebook groups which shared extremist content did so at the recommendation of Facebook. And it's that business model that we should be regulating.
Chris, do you think it should be regulated under the same sort of rules that we?
Old habits die hard.
It's only been 4 weeks. I still think of.
I understand. I think that, everybody has different roles to play in the media landscape, and to a certain extent, just going back to the argument I was making earlier on, I think what we have to do within BBC Local Radio is we are that trusted voice. I also think that I take on board everything that Damian is saying there about, if you like, scaremongering and the disinformation that goes on. But there's something also about, I do think audiences are smart and will go to different media in different mood states. And I think we are, and I say this as someone who lived in America for a period, we're a very different country to America. We're not quite the same. And I think that we can certainly learn a lot from a lot of what goes on over there. I think some of the things you see politically at the moment, I don't believe necessarily would happen over here. I think we're a different kind of person, character.
We always start these things with a list of questions and think, are there enough questions there? And I've got to about number 2 on a list of 15. So we've got to wrap up. Chris Burns, Damian Collins, Matt Deegan, Owen Evans, thanks very much. And back to Colin Brown.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to the panel for a very interesting discussion on a really interesting topic and one close to the heart of VLV members. Really appreciate that. Thanks very much indeed. And generally looking at the discussions we've had over the course of this morning, it's a busy time ahead. There's so many important decisions to be taken that will, of course, keep us in the VLB extremely occupied. The input to play a part in these important issues like PSB review, like the funding of the BBC, and the funding indeed of S4C. So I'm so pleased that we've covered so much ground today, and thank you all participants for that.